that you're welcome to go to our website and check out this after we get done, to watch the video from our website sometime next week. So if you do have questions, use the chat feature and I will keep that loaded up so that if questions pop on, I can kind of catch them in the flow of my talking. And I will stay around if there's time at the end to like have a chat exchange and unmute ourselves, what have you. So that's how we'll kind of run the meeting. So today, the topic that I came prepared to chat with y'all about is the importance of circulation in health and disease. And I believe the way that it was titled was discussing the blood and lymphatic systems and the tools that we can use to optimize the function of these systems and how that can support our vitality and health and help heal illnesses. So it's really, I like to draw back to the roots of the medicine I practice and remember where my profession came from in any topic that I am excited to speak about. And so it's important to share with you all, I think, that the founding practitioners and philosophers of naturopathic medicine, circulation was very much at the heart of their premise of what both causes disease and what cures disease. And there's a term called the Unifying theory of disease that a doctor named Louis Kuhn created and was adopted by the profession as it formed over the past couple hundred years. And that unifying theory is that all diseases arise from the accumulation of morbid matter in the body. And I'm going to kind of modernize that term for our purposes. So I could say that all disturbance in the body arises from the accumulation of toxins in the tissues. And so the principle of naturopathy in very simplistic terms, and this is interestingly, I would say, how I approach every case that presents to me and every person that I'm working with, is that I try to understand how the body is communicating the accumulation of toxins, and that's going to be unique to each of us, and learn about how that's happening in a person, and then work with that person to reduce the accumulation of toxins and remove the existing toxic burden in their bodies. And the belief being that in the absence of a toxic accumulated burden in the body, that the body's natural condition is one of vitality and health. And that it is only because of that accumulation of toxicity that we develop disturbance, disease, imbalance. So the naturopathic theory goes that our job as practitioners is to guide people and give lifestyle medicinal applications that will clean the blood, that will filter and detoxify the blood. Because when we do that, then we allow the natural state of physiology to thrive. And so that conversation has always been in naturopathic medicine, had a very core connection to circulation and the systems in the body known as our circulatory and our lymphatic system. So I listened to a lecture on the lymphatic system and circulatory system that I think is a good metaphor to understand kind of what we are made of. And so the metaphor I'm going to use is an aquarium. So in an aquarium, in a healthy one, you got sparkling crystal clear water. And in there, you got your rocks and you got your fish and your crabs and your frogs and your whatever animals, and you got your corals, and they're all thriving. And below, what you got is this complex filtration system that is keeping that water crystal clear and all the nutrients flowing in healthy environment for all those organisms to thrive in. And so if you kind of do a comparison of that aquarium to the human body, the comparison would be all of the fish and frogs and corals and rocks and contents of the aquarium would be your tissues and your organs, your heart, your liver, your kidneys, your lungs, your intestinal tract, mitochondria, just all the structures in your body. And the glass of the tank would be your skin holding it all in, right? And then all of that crystal clear fluid would be your circulatory substances, which comprise primarily your blood and your lymph. And those constituents, interestingly, if we look at volumes in the body, we're talking about 5 liters in the arterial venous circulatory system. So that's the blood, and about 15 liters or 3 times as much lymphatic fluid, which is the lymph system. And so, you know, that's a lot of substance that our body's made of that comprise those fluids. And as I said, the filtration system really focuses in on one of the primary roles of what the lymphatic system does, which is it acts as a filter for our body to filter out toxins. And if we draw back to the unifying theory of disease, we remember that the accumulation of toxins is what creates disease. So it reasons to logic that the filtration and removal of toxins is what helps restore the conditions for health. And so this lymphatic fluid, which I'm going to focus today's lecture more on the lymphatic system because it's more interesting and I think lesser understood by most of us, is also known as interstitial fluid. And it wraps around this kind of organ system called our lymph. It wraps around our entire body, every tissue. It touches everything. It basically bathes all of our tissues, cells, structures, organs in this extracellular fluid, interstitial fluid. And that's the metaphor with the water of the aquarium, right? And so if it gets really dirty and polluted, then the cells start to also become toxic, malnourished, and devitalized. And so one of our big questions in caring for people is to understand, is their circulatory lymphatic system compromised? Does it have a large toxic burden? And how do we go about moving and repairing and restoring the quality of the lymphatic fluid and circulatory system? So that's kind of our efforts and something I'm always looking really closely at. And the lymphatic system, its organization is interesting. So you've probably heard the term lymph node, which is, in most people especially, have heard of that term when it comes to cancer and people saying, the cancer is in the lymph nodes, which brings up a really important point in that the lymphatic system is where, again, like we said, toxins hang out and get dumped, and it almost acts like, we could call it like a sewer in our body. It also could be looked at as a sewer system. So a lot of those toxins, release into the sewer system. But it also, interestingly, has a very important secondary, or even some people would say primary role, as a place where our immune system hangs out and where a lot of our immune cells live. And so it's also our lymph system that is there not only to help us detoxify and, sweep out the sewage of our cellular activities, but it's also there to protect us against harmful substances. We call them viruses, bacteria, antigens, toxins, right? The many, many different types of compounds that our lymphatic system not only binds up and carries out of the body, but it also houses these immune cells that will actively go search and destroy and kind of swallow up these harmful particles. And so that immune role is interesting. And there's these things called neutrophils, macrophages, B cells, T cells, words you may have heard about. And this is not an immunology lecture, so I'm not going to go into depth. But these are basically constituents of the immune system that mostly live in the lymphatic fluid and circulate around protecting us. And they tend to hang out in these nodes that we call lymph nodes. And there's a few key places where those lymph nodes are extra concentrated, and it makes a lot of sense when you think about it, where they tend to concentrate or where our lymph centers and hubs are. So the biggest center and hub is the gut lining. It's called gut-associated lymphatic tissue, and the term is called Peyer's patches. And these are associated with largely our small intestine, but other parts of our intestine too. And this is the really interesting part if we really zoom out and want to talk about the immune system and health and disease. This is a big, big interaction, because those immune tissues, that gut-associated lymphatic tissue, is in very close proximity to the inside of the intestines, which is where all of our food ends up, where a lot of bugs live that are part of our body, the so-called microbiome. A lot of substrates come in through our mouth and into our intestinal system. And there's a major interrelationship between that lymphatic tissue and the bugs and substrates in our gut. And when that's really balanced and healthy, our immune system is really balanced and healthy for the most part. When we start to get a lot of irritation and inflammation and infection going on in the gut, and imbalance in microbes, the gut lining, the little thin membrane that separates the lymph tissue from the inside of the gut, breaks down. We get a process called leaky gut. And all of those undigested foods and all of those pathogens, those microbes, start to seep into the lymphatic tissue and start a big old immune inflammatory response. And this is very much the mechanism through which we develop immune dysregulatory conditions like autoimmune diseases, like allergies, like arthritis. I mean, really any condition, I would say, that my patients present with, there's at least some component of this lymph gut interface causing some reactivity in the immune system, lymphatic system. And so I just want to bring that up because it's such an important element of how our lymphatic systems evolved in our body's health. Okay. So basically, you got these lymphatic tissues which have immune cells in them, but they're also kind of carrying cellular debris. And the whole idea is that it's a circle, it's a circuit that you have these tissues bringing all of this waste debris, circling it from the peripheral tissues, bringing it back to the heart, and then it mixes with the blood and pumps back through the body. And what ends up happening, and this is where the circulatory and lymphatic system kind of interface, right? Because the heart is pumping the blood into the lungs, which it reoxygenates, it brings it fresh oxygen, and circulates the blood out to the tissues. And then the plasma, which is part of the blood lymphatic kind of interface, leaks out into the tissues with a lot of the nourishment, and then starts to pick up waste debris, and is essentially moves into the lymphatic system where it then gets carried eventually back to the heart. And then when it gets moved from the heart, all of those kind of waste debris and stuff eventually get shuttled to your main elimination organs, which are your liver and bowels, is the one through your gut, right? So the liver is a place of processing, and then pushing that as bile into the intestines and out as poop. And then you have the water soluble components being detoxified by the liver and then flushed out into the kidneys to be eliminated as urine waste. And then your kind of a little less central detox elimination organs are your lungs, right? So when we breathe out, we're breathing out toxins and breathing in fresh oxygen, basically. And we also detoxify through the skin. Sweating is a really beautiful way to detoxify. But we're also, the skin is not an utterly impermeable barrier. So it is permeable and things can move out the skin. I'm not going to spend a lot of time today talking about the elimination organs, the liver, bowels, kidneys, skin, and lungs, because there's hours and hours of talking I could do about those systems. But it's really important for our purposes with the circulatory and lymph system to understand that if those elimination organs are not working really efficiently, if they're really sluggish, if they're really shut down or compromised, then everything backs up, right? It's like, you got a plugged up drain in your shower, right? Pretty soon you're going to be just, swimming in your bathtub when you're taking a shower versus showering, because everything's backing up because that pipe is clogged. So the compromise of elimination organs is a really big deal. And whenever we're really working to optimize circulation in draining that lymphatic sewer system, we need to also keep in mind and simultaneously be working to optimize the function of those elimination organs. So just kind of aside, and I think I've lectured on that plenty of times. I do my group juice detox every fall and spring. We get really into that in the lecture part of it. So, and we talk about this, of course, all the time with my patients working together, is how are those endpoint elimination organs doing, and how can we, strengthen their function and elimination capacity. Another caveat to put out before we dive a little more deeply into the lymphatic system is the reminder of the unifying theory of disease and the concept of the intake and accumulation of toxins, right? So in the end of the day, it's not enough to open the elimination pathways and get the lymphatic sewer system and circulatory system really cranking. If we're dumping toxins into the system continually, it's never going to run clean. And so we need to remember that a huge part of, the whole restoring the conditions for health is minimizing, reducing the intake of toxins. And by the way, that's not just toxins in food or alcohol or tobacco. I mean, toxicity is very wide sweeping. It's environmental, it's electromagnetics, it's the air we breathe, And I find in my practice that the biggest toxin of all that's underappreciated in the care for people's health is the toxicity of stress and mental emotional stuckness of toxic emotion and um, toxic thoughts. So those are all types of things that we can work on transforming, reducing exposure to, and a very important part of what constitutes health. However, we're not going to talk about that in depth today. We're going to mainly focus on this lymphatic system and how we can work with it and make it healthy. Um, so I've talked about the functions of how the lymphatic system works. I've talked about kind of where parts of it reside. I said the biggest part is in the gut and that whole, importance of the immune system in the gut, but also a large number of the lymphatic structures are right under the skin in the dermis. And that's really significant when we start to think about how to treat the lymph, because it turns out that we don't have to be super intense and aggressive to move lymphatic fluid. It's so close to the surface, much of it, that very gentle interventions can do a lot to mobilize it. Um, and then the other interesting thing that's very important clinically in health is that about a third of the lymph nodes and much of the lymphatic fluid is in and around the head and neck. So many people suffer from conditions of the head and the neck. We talk about chronic sinus issues, chronic earaches. We talk about headaches. We talk about pain. We talk about dental issues. We talk about eye issues, right? Cognition, just brain fog. I mean, huge issue for a lot of people. Well, turns out that much of the reason that people experience these issues, in my opinion, often is because the circulatory system and lymphatic system draining the head is pinched off and is compromised. Um, and so that's a really big deal, is understanding that principle and then working with that circulatory flow to unkink things. And that does bring up a really key concept, which is, and this is actually not something I directly practice and do for my patients. I do a lot of teaching about self-administration, but let's face it, there's a theory of health that says structure equals function. And when the structure is not correct, then the function is not correct. And so in that model, looking at structure, we have to appreciate that we live a modernized life at desks and in chairs and in cars and in repetitive motions and in generally much less activity in our ancestors. And we're stressed a lot. And so we tend to develop a lot of tension and misalignment of our structures in our body, of our muscles, our ligaments, our tendons, our nerves, and things literally get kind of crimped and crunched and pinched off. Turns out that does affect the lymphatic system, that's this huge 15-liter structure in our body, very significantly, and therefore the flow of lymph can become restricted. So that effort of keeping structures in alignment and improving flow is very, very important. And I'm pretty blunt about telling my patients, if we get into a discussion about structure, that I really feel that all of us really need and would benefit from maintenance body work from a really, skilled practitioner, depending on what our bodies are, responsive to. That could be a massage therapist. That could be who's doing kind of deeper tissue work. That could be, there's so many practitioners and types. I mean, I could make a huge list. Talk about Reiki, cranial sacral therapy, Feldenkrais, structural integration, Rolfing, and various fashions of massage techniques, definitely chiropractic, traditional osteopathy, visceral manipulation. Again, there's a huge list of people who have essentially become experts in their knowledge of how to realign structures in the human body. And these type of practitioners can be very, very beneficial in helping our lymphatic fluids flow unobstructed. And so I really encourage, all my patients to invest in themselves in that way, and not just when they're hurting like heck, but actually have a monthly standing meeting with your body workers that your body responds to. Another modality I should mention that works in a little bit different way, but often really helps the circulatory function, is acupuncture. So another good thought to have out there is as a modality. And these are all people in my practice that I know very well in terms of who I send my patients to, because I've enjoyed these practitioners' works personally often, and also had a lot of feedback and had a lot of networking with them to know the kind of quality of work they're doing. So if we have a future meeting and you want to integrate, some more body work, I also might be a resource to kind of point you in a helpful direction. So that idea of structure being aligned is a really big deal. And, also the kinds of things that we each do to keep our structure aligned, right? So prevention is always, the best. So, what kind of chair we sit in, how we hold our posture, how we sleep, what we do in the evening, good habits, bad habits, like all those things are really going to, influence our structural alignment. And yeah, so I will leave that part of that circulatory connection at that. So the next thing I want to kind of touch on with the lymphatic system is, and circulatory system, I should say, is if our theory is, as long as our elimination organs are working, that what we really want to do is get that sewage moving, get that lymph circulating so we can clear out the fluids that we're bathing all of our tissues in. Then we need to understand, how do we mobilize lymphatic fluid? And so if you remember me saying that lymph lies on the surface, we can actually do some pretty gentle things to move lymphatic fluid and circulate it. I'm a big fan of a tool called a dry skin brush, which we have at the clinic. You can get them on Amazon for $5. Get them at a health food store. They're kind of a horsehair, little rough bristled brush. And I like to keep mine in the shower, and as I turn the water on and it gets hot, I do a quick minute or so of starting at my extremities. And again, remember, the lymph fluid returns to the heart. So you want to move from the periphery to the heart. And I start in my feet and brush up all aspects of my legs. Then I do that with my arms. And then I do that with the front, side, and back of my torso every day for a minute or so, usually before I take a shower. And that's a really simple 1 minute, basically free practice that you could literally incorporate the rest of your life. And it would be very beneficial to mobilizing that lymphatic fluid. It also kind of, that methodology makes me lead into probably my favorite tool and my biggest modality, and one that I'm pretty obsessed with personally, and I teach every day, which is the use of water to mobilize the lymphatic and circulatory fluids. And the term that we use is hydrotherapy. And hydrotherapy is the modality that our ancestral naturopathic forefathers used as their main tool in the process of restoring health. And so again, that unifying theory of disease, they learned that if we could therapeutically apply the application of water to the body in a way that cleaned the blood and cleaned the lymph, then we would restore health and cure disease. And so the big thing about water as therapy externally is the idea in the contrast of temperatures of hot and cold. And this relies on very basic principles in physics, which has to do with whenever you quickly, rapidly contrast hot and cold to a skin surface, the blood vessels, lymphatic tissue, and nerves at the surface will, depending on whether it's hot or cold, if it's hot, the blood vessels and lymph will expand and what's called vasodilate. And if the temperature is cold, they will constrict or vasoconstrict. And what that does is it literally creates a pumping action to our blood and lymph and essentially pumps those waste products back to the eliminatory organs and then pumps fresh nutrients and blood supply out to the tissues. And so I do a lot of prescribing of alternating, contrasting hot and cold to the skin surface. And I do it as a general health tonic. I do it in the presentation of acute illnesses. I do it for prevention and for the treatment of chronic illnesses. And the real fun thing about this is you can literally use contrast hydrotherapy to treat any specific tissue that's particularly compromised. And it's amazing at restoring health. So you could do it to the pelvis, you can do it to the lungs, you can do it to the head, or alternatively, interestingly, you can treat the head by putting wet socks on someone's feet and covering them with a thick wool sock. And the body warming up that wet sock will pull congestion out of the head. So there's a whole science to this that is, very rich and very wide in its application. But the big take home is this use of contrasting hot and cold is something I encourage everybody to incorporate in their life. And there's a very practical, simple way to do it, which is through the use of showering, which most people do, hot and cold rinses. And at the very least, ending your showers on a 30-second cold rinse where you start like with the brush at your peripheries, at your feet and hand, and come up your legs, then come up your arms, then your torso, and then by rinsing your head. Now, you can do several cycles in the shower. That'll make it more therapeutic. To make that contrast work even more therapeutic, what you can do is do actual immersive hydrotherapy. So what I have is a hot tub at my house, and I have a aluminum trough outside of my hot tub that was under $100. That's, probably 5 feet long and 3 feet high, a couple feet wide. And I go back and forth from my hot tub in cycles every day when I wake up. And you don't really, there's no way to describe the invigoration of it. You kind of have to experience it, but it is a very powerful therapy for moving the blood and lymph. And again, is way more therapeutic even than the showers. And an important principle is you always end on a cold rinse. So that's the most appropriate way to optimize that movement of circulatory lymphatic fluids. So again, I could talk about all different permeations of hydrotherapy. And many of you have probably heard about Wim Hof, this guy, this kind of kooky Finnish guy who's all about basically immersing in icy cold water for sustained periods. But even just cold water immersion does many of these same incredible properties that we find with contrast hydrotherapy. And for those of you who are cringing and saying, this sounds terrible and I'm going to be so cold if I do that, The interesting thing is, unless you're incredibly devitalized, that ending on the cold causes the nervous system to cause a reflexive vasodilation to the skin surface, which actually warms us up. So I find that I have become much warmer as a general rule in my constitution because of my years of doing hydrotherapy and the cold rinses. So just kind of sharing that. So that's a big deal, and that's a big methodology of supporting lymphatic health, and probably one of my biggest go-tos. Now, I want to describe some other modalities that I think are very valuable also to move the lymph. One of my favorites is I like sauna therapy or sweating therapy. So that can be a really good tool, a good 30 minutes of sweating, even better if you can end it with a cold rinse. And in that case, we're kind of taking some of that lymph that's right by the skin surface, and we're just popping those toxins right out of the skin in the form of sweat. That's a really nice tool. In modern times, there's a couple of new, fancier technological tools. One of them is called a beamer. And there's also something called a PEMF mat, or pulsed electromagnetic frequency. But this idea that we can move lymph by interfacing with the body with certain frequencies of wavelengths electromagnetically. And so those are kind of fun tools that have a lot of merit. Another tool that is frequency related is what's called red light therapy. That is the incorporation of visible light, red light, and infrared light in the form of a panel of lasers that do deep penetration and activate that circulatory lymphatic fluid and mobilize it. We have a practitioner here, Ty, who has a red light room in the clinic that patients can get packages and come kind of, quote unquote, cook in front of the red light for 30-minute sessions. And that's a really useful detoxifying strategy. You could also get home units too. So those are some nice kind of newer generational tools that exist. Another thing that I haven't talked about, but is probably the most fundamental, is exercise and motion. I probably should have started here in describing that. How is it that we ultimately move in our blood and lymph more than anything? Well, we have the pumping mechanism of the heart. Of course, that's an internal muscle that's involuntary. But that heart will work and pump and circulate much more efficiently if our muscles and tissues are helping out. And the way that we get our muscles and tissues to help is we move. So just plain and simple, moving our bodies is the single most fundamental way that we mobilize and activate the lymphatic circulatory structures out of a place of more stagnancy or limited flow. And so I believe in this unifying theory of disease in terms of moving the blood and lymph being so foundational to the restoration of health, that exercise is of utmost importance in our daily life. And it is probably at the very top pinnacle, in the top 2 or 3 to me, determining forces of good health. So I'm always on pretty much everyone I talk to, hear about how are you doing with movement? How much are you moving? How much are you exercising? Because it has such a big impact on this aspect of health and many others in terms of metabolism and cognition and mental emotional health and stress response and all those things. But anyways, exercise is a big, big deal. And it doesn't have to be some specific form of exercise. There are many ways to exercise. And I really just tell people, let's find a way that you enjoy and that you can make ritualistic or a daily practice. So that exercise is huge. Now, the other area that's worth mentioning is the area of our medicines that we have to facilitate and activate the movement of lymphatic fluid. So this is not something I focus heavily on. I do feel that what I've covered with you so far is much more prominent in terms of what makes the biggest difference of healthy circulation function. But I also think that some of these medicines can be very synergistic. So I'm going to talk about the herbal medicines first that are very helpful for the activation of circulation. And the herbs that I will list are ginger, rosemary, cayenne, and ginkgo are amongst my favorites. Unfortunately, some of these, rosemary, ginger, and cayenne, are actually just spices that you can cook with, and you will get a circulatory benefit from the use of those spices. So that's a very low cost way to incorporate those substances. Now, there's a couple of others that are lower dose herbs that you have to be careful with quantities. Red root or ceanothus is a very good herb for this purpose. Poke, P-O-K-E, or phytolacca is a really excellent lymphatic stimulating herb. And actually, echinacea, believe it or not, is really big in this arena. We don't think of it. We think of echinacea in the immune system, but the best way that echinacea works is by really, really activating the lymphatic system. So these herbs can be found in formulas. When I'm working on someone with their lymphatic systems, I might make them a tincture that combines many of these herbs. But great to be aware of their benefit to the circulatory lymphatic system. And additionally, another tool I use synergistically as a medicine is a formula called Iteries, which is a homeopathic preparation. And Iteries is basically several homeopathic medicines combined into one that I have found synergistically really helps move the lymph and blood well. Someone asked me if I could write the names of the herbs, so I'm doing so right now. And then you will have those. So red root, and then echinacea. Okay. So I guess to real sum up here, there is this very important system in our body called our circulatory lymphatic system. It is literally our lifeblood of moving nourishment and removing toxins and waste debris from our bodies. And when it is not functioning properly, as the metaphor goes, we have a really dirty aquarium. And you know what happens if an aquarium gets too dirty? Everything in it dies. And so if we don't have healthy, moving, clean circulatory fluids, we are going to set up conditions for the destruction of health and the creation of disturbance or disease. Once we clean and move the circulation and lymphatic tissues, then we restore those conditions for health and raise vitality and remove disease. And there's some very, very simple ways to support that process that we talked about today, involving hydrotherapy, body work, exercise, skin brushing, and the use synergistically of different herbal medicines to really ramp up those efforts. So Without further ado, then, thank you all for being here. I will kind of open the floor for questions, and feel free, if you'd like to unmute yourself. I allowed that option, and you can feel free to chime in. And it doesn't have to just be lymph questions. It can be any question that you have you want to bring up in general in relation to health. So I'm going to stop this recording for the lecture topic and hang around here for a few minutes. Thank you.